We are in a powerful movement for social change, an anti-racism movement that seeks justice for all peoples. And it looks like some heads are gonna roll. Statue heads, that is. The statues of historical leaders like Sir John A. Macdonald from Canada or Confederate General Robert Lee from the United States, who promoted or implemented slavery and genocide, are being spray painted, decapitated, and toppled with great fanfare. These statues represent some of the worst parts of our collective histories. Yet, some people fear that our history will be lost forever unless we protect these monuments. Stay tuned to learn more about what to do about these racist statues. Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tansei Sego. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us save our peoples and the planet. In Canada and the United States, historical leaders who advocated for, supported, or implemented slavery and genocide have been immortalized in thousands of statues and monuments. But so too has their white nationalist ideologies. And contrary to being heroes of Canadian Confederation or American independence, these historical leaders, usually white men, represent some of the worst of our collective histories. The exploitation, torture, violence, dispossession, oppression, and deaths of countless Black and Indigenous peoples. Yet from schoolyards and community parks to the grounds outside of government buildings and courthouses, these statues form an important part of the national mythology that is Canada and the US. At the same time, Black and Indigenous peoples are either erased, relegated to belittling caricatures, or outright racialized, mocked, and vilified. And don't even get me started on racist team mascots. And we can't get away from the fact that these statues are a form of subliminal messaging that serves to normalize and reinforce white nationalism and racism that explanatory plaques, footnotes, or brief mentions on historical walking tours simply cannot combat. In the last few months, during the massive anti-racism and police brutality protests in Canada and the US, statues of historical Canadian figures like Sir John A. Macdonald or Governor Cornwallis have been spray painted, decapitated, or toppled entirely. Only yesterday, protesters in Montreal toppled a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, calling on governments to defund racist and violent police forces. In Ontario, several other statues were covered in paint. Similarly, statues of Columbus or Confederate leaders have been toppled in the United States. And while these actions have been getting a lot of attention recently, the calls to remove these white nationalist statues are not new. Black and Indigenous peoples, together with other marginalized peoples, have been working in solidarity to get rid of these powerful symbols of racism and violence. Don't forget, it was only 3 years ago in 2017 that protests broke out after Charlottesville City Council voted to remove 2 statues which they said promoted racism. The response to this positive decision was met with violence by those who cling to racism. White nationalists and neo-Nazis protested and resorted to violence against those who supported the city's decision. One of those neo-Nazis rammed his car into a crowd of anti-racism protesters, killing 1 and injuring 35. In the same year, here in Canada, 5 armed forces members, who have been described to be part of a white nationalist hate group of far-right neo-Nazis who glorify violence, interrupted Mi'kmaq ceremonies over the Cornwallis statue in Nova Scotia. The statues of these historical leaders in both countries who were responsible for such gruesome racialized violence still inspire racialized violence in white nationalist groups today. And that's part of the problem. It's also part of the reason why calls to address these statues are increasing. Many people want them removed, but others want them to stay right where they are. But how can we possibly move towards addressing systemic racism, racism that is ingrained in our laws, economies, and societal practices, without removing the symbols of that racism? What are we going to do? Commission plaques for every statue, road sign, and building name? That serves only to reinforce and maintain the status quo, but at great human cost. For us, there is literally no escape from the promotion of white nationalism and the so-called heroes that embody these values. Take a look at the Declaration of Independence. Native peoples are literally referenced as merciless Indian savages. They are described as a people whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That the drafters were literally describing themselves and their own violent, indiscriminate genocide of Native peoples. Here in Canada, you can literally drive down Colonization Road, send your kids to Cornwallis School, or take law classes in Sir John A. Macdonald Building. Who is Cornwallis? Well, Governor Edward Cornwallis issued a scalping proclamation to pay bounties to anyone who would kill Mi'kmaq people, including children, to drive them off the lands. And this was after peace treaties had been signed. We all know Sir John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada, but we also know he was responsible for the starvation of Indians. In 1882, he told the House of Commons, and I quote, "I have reason to believe that the agents as a whole are doing all they can by refusing food until the Indians are on the verge of starvation to reduce the expense." Thousands died under these starvation policies, and when that wasn't enough to force their submission, Sir John A. Macdonald wrote, "The execution of the Indians ought to convince the red man that the white man governs." His views about Native children were no better. He thought that they were savages, surrounded by savages, and that the focus should be on removing them from their parents. Something that Duncan Campbell Scott was all too happy to do, even when it resulted in the deaths of thousands of children. The point is, from celebrations of Independence Day in the US or Canada Day here in Canada, the true histories of Canadian and American leaders are hidden, whitewashed, or outright fictionalized to create this powerful national myth. It should be no surprise that for the most part, we still have white men as governors and Black and Indigenous peoples as the impoverished, brutalized, and imprisoned, and then blamed for it. That is exactly how the normalization of racism and violence works. The commissioning, strategic placement, and protection of these statues of prominent white nationalist leaders serves to continually reinforce the values that these namesakes represent: racism, slavery, genocide, and violence. So, how do we deal with the dissonance between Canadian and American pride and nostalgia related to the national myths of settlement versus the historic and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples that has resulted in their intergenerational trauma and loss of life? And how do we reconcile Canada and the United States' violent history of Black slavery when we look around today and see numerous police killings, brutalizations, and the over-incarceration of Black people? Well, the answer is we shouldn't. We shouldn't try to reconcile these two things. We shouldn't try to preserve the status quo. And we shouldn't relegate slavery and genocide to a footnote or a plaque. That would dishonor the lives and memories and experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples who were brutalized for the sake of settlement and wealth, and ignore the intergenerational consequences lived by our families and communities today. The racism upon which Canada and the US was created must be confronted head-on and eliminated, not preserved. We don't need thousands of statues of Sir John A. Macdonald or Christopher Columbus to remember our history. White men have already written the history books, and there is zero risk that our children will stop learning about presidents and prime ministers, generals and governors. After the Holocaust, Germany didn't burn all of their history books because they knew it was important to never forget the genocide that Hitler committed, to make sure that it never happens again. Same here. It's important to know our history. All of it, the good and the bad. But that doesn't mean that schools in Germany need to be named after Hitler or have Hitler statues in public parks. Germany took the important steps of removing symbols of Nazism, removing statues, monuments, symbols from buildings, street signs, and removed Nazi books from the libraries. They also held military and government officials to account, something that Canada and the United States has never done. Germany has put in the hard work over many decades to lead by example from the top down and take the steps needed to make the kind of societal change to get rid of violent racism. Canada and the US, on the other hand, sit in a precarious position of Western arrogance and superiority, believing themselves immune from accountability for all of their genocidal acts. Yet here in Canada, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls found Canada guilty of genocide. And Canada has resumed business as usual. That shows you the power of the status quo. It's always working to preserve itself, no matter how racist or violent it is. Canada and the US were founded on white nationalist ideologies, and governments created their laws, policies, practices, economies, and societies in a way that preserved white nationalism and condemned and punished Black and Indigenous peoples. While we struggle to address systemic racism in all of Canadian and US systems, we won't be successful unless we also address the way that racism is normalized, and that includes statues. And it's hard to imagine that some people would be more concerned about the safety of steel and concrete statues over the health, safety, and well-being of actual living human beings who have been excluded, marginalized, and oppressed by the violence and racism that these statues represent. So no, if we remove Sir John A. Macdonald and General Lee's statues, history won't be lost. That's what our education system, books, archives, and museums are for. And no, removing these statues is not about being anti-Canadian or anti-American. Removing these statues is about being anti-racist, which should be a core part of Canadian and American identity. And no, removing statues is not about cancel culture. It's about a reckoning and accountability for the harms done in the past and ending the harms that continue in the present. The glorification of those who advocated slavery and genocide hurts us all, and it's long past time for us to come together and pave a new path forward. And I also see lots of municipalities and town councils engaging in these important discussions, actually listening to those who have been impacted and taking the important steps of removing those statues, changing street names, and finding ways to better represent Black and Indigenous peoples in society. And make sure you keep a lookout for notice of my upcoming live video where I'll do an overview of all the issues that we covered in this racism series and then focus most of the time on answering your questions. I'm really looking forward to that. So make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified every time I upload a video. For my channel members, be sure to check out the regular posts in our members chat section. And if you haven't joined my channel, check it out. We are a really engaged community learning together in solidarity. Thank you all for watching. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.